I don't know that it's directly Luciferian in its context, but I will say that anything that opposes my creative nature, I treat as the devil itself.
Yeah.
If I notice that it's, it's shutting me down creatively, it's got to be an enemy. Because that's the one thing I can say that feels divine in all of us is our creative essence, So it's like if you're just shutting that down, then you've got to be the devil himself.
You're listening to the Ferment podcast, conversations about worship and transformation. Today's guest is Gabriel Wilson. Gabriel is a record producer, songwriter, and recording artist based in the greater Portland, Oregon area. He's best known for his work with John Mark McMillan, Bethel Music, Martin Smith, and Lindy Conant and the Circuit Riders. This episode is brought to you by Monk Drums. Monk Drums is a creative desert venture that strives to combine beauty and business as one heartbeat. Monk Drums' main focus is handcrafted wooden drums that allow us to love, assist, and serve all who accompany us on this path. Use the coupon code FERMENTPOD to get 5% off your Monk Drums order. Find them on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at Monk Drums. And every Monday, look for hashtag Monk Drum Monday. Speaking from personal experience, Monk Drums are wonderfully crafted and they sound amazing. They blend the best traits of both the djembe and the cajon, and I found them to be incredibly versatile in both the live and studio environment. Check them out at monkdrums.com. This episode is brought to you by our friends at worshipteam.com. Worship Team comes preloaded with over 12,000 songs with new songs being added all the time. Hillsong, Bethel, Vineyard, Jesus Culture, Passion, just to name a few. Service building with Worship Team is a snap, and all the songs are completely legal and licensed. Visit them at worshipteam.com today for a free trial. You can also find them on social media, Facebook at worshipteam.com, Twitter at worshipteam, Instagram at worshipteam_WT. Complete worship planning with thousands of songs, easy interface, mobile apps, and legal rights for your church. All you need in one place, worshipteam.com.
Hey everybody, this is Mike O'Brien, director of the Vineyard School of Worship. Our latest single, Be Still, written by my good friend Jason Phillips, is the latest of our monthly singles available on the first Friday of every month. Jason is the pastor of worship and arts at the Raleigh Vineyard in North Carolina. Check it out wherever you listen to music.
Hey, what up, everybody? My name is Adam Russell. You're listening to the Ferment podcast, and I have a special guest today. I'm with Gabe Wilson, and I am in the Pacific Northwest. Is this correct?
Yeah, it's the best part of the world.
It is cloudy, but it's kind of warm.
I mean, well, it depends on your definition of warm. It's 39 degrees outside at this time. So.
Listen, compared to Kentucky, it's warm. We're calling it.
Amazing.
It's,
all right.
It's a balmy 42.
Yeah, it feels good. It feels really good right now.
Yeah, well, Gabe, you are a musician.
Yeah, I by trade, maybe a record producer.
Yeah, but I'm saying like you've covered all these bases. You're a musician, you make records, you've been in bands.
Done the artist thing, yeah.
Yeah, you've done all those things. And I think people are aware, especially they're aware of the records that you've made in the last few years, especially.
I think so, yeah. They've probably John Mark's Mercury Lightning and like Bethel Music's Tides and You Make Me Brave are probably the more recognized ones.
I know we can get to there, and I want to get to there, but I want to go back and maybe have you just tell us where you're from.
Okay.
How'd you grow up? Did you know Jesus? Like, what was your family like? Where'd you come from, and what was it like as a kid?
Yeah, so that's all very good questions. I was born in Tulsa, Oklahoma, actually. My mom married my dad when she was super young. Not because she was pregnant, but just, I guess that's how they rolled back in the day.
Listen, that's how my wife and I were.
So my mom married my dad when she was 16, and he was a traveling preacher. And then they got pregnant with me around, I think my mom was 21 when she gave birth. And then they divorced a couple years later. And so I didn't really get to know my dad a whole lot. And I didn't find out till a lot later in life that I kind of came from some pretty big like gospel music roots. My dad's brother is Donnie McGuire, and he married Reba Rambo, who's Dottie Rambo's daughter. And, you know, there's just like this whole Southern gospel legacy that has kind of always been in my blood. My mom remarried when I was 6, and my stepdad and mom and I moved around a ton. So I was pretty nomadic from the time I was 6 till I was 15. And I think that made for a life that trained me to travel on the road. Because, you know, by the time I was in high school, I had gypsy blood and was excited to start a band and get on the road, you know?
Yeah. Did you grow up in church?
I grew up in a Christian home, but we were never in church. Mostly we would go to a church, but we were, you know, I moved 24 times from the time I was 6 till I was 15. So there was no like roots at all.
Yeah.
And no real time to go to a church more than a couple times. But I gave my heart to the Lord when I was 4. And I remember it like super clearly. It was a big moment because my parents had divorced and I didn't really know a whole lot about anything except I knew Jesus was good and divorce was bad. And I lost my dad and I was in a lot of pain. And I didn't want that. So I remember asking Grandma if she'd pray for me, and, you know, and asking Jesus into my heart. You know, like your classic.
Did you bring that conversation up?
Yeah, I did actually. That was all. Yeah, I just remember it as clear as day. So that was a big moment, and I never really, you know, turned away from that. I think, like all of us, our faith evolves, and you know, and you find out more about who the Lord is and who you are in the Lord and all that. But you know, I was kind of always on the outskirts of the church because I just didn't know how to belong to a church because I didn't grow up belonging to a church. I wasn't a part of a church until, you know, like 90s, and I was out of high school, and then, you know, the Vineyard music thing was happening.
Yeah.
Violet Burning was the band that changed everything for me.
Yeah.
I remember that was the first time I'd seen the intensity of rock and roll with the atmosphere of worship, and I was like, "This is what I want to do." So,
where did you see?
I didn't ever see that. Well, I
or
guess
did you just get the record?
Yeah, I just got the record. It was the record Strength, and man, what a moment in time! I'll never forget it. That was the Tubbs Brothers iteration of the Violet Burning. It was so killer, you know. Yeah. And then, later I'm, you know, in musical excursions and whatnot, I met Michael Pritzel from the band and got to work with them in the studio, and I, you know, just a lot of really cool things that happened, but they were so formative. That was prior to King of Fools and everything, you know, with Delirious. So, yeah, but that's when I was a teenager. I found my first real church home, and I played drums on the worship team first because I was primarily a drummer. And then in the process of just wanting to learn how to write songs, I taught myself to play guitar, and then would just write songs.
And what kind of church was that?
A crazy charismatic church. It was nuts.
People fell down?
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of Toronto blessing-y, so you'd have like,
was it mid-90s?
Yeah, mid-90s.
Well, yeah, but everybody was Toronto blessing you in the mid-90s, right?
Yeah, so like intercessors like would break chairs, and as the Lord would knock them down, and you always knew that you were doing good as a worship leader when everybody started yelling "ho," and you know, you know what I mean. So, but it was the kind of church though that was great because you could really screw up, and it just didn't matter. Like you could sing spontaneous. I remember one time trying to lead like an intercessory moment I had just gotten this really cool delay pedal called a Memory Man.
Yeah.
And then another one called an Electric Mistress. And I just knelt on my knees and probably made those pedals talk to each other for like 20 minutes. And, you know, it's
people went with it.
Kind of, but you know,
yes, of course.
But you could do that and not get ousted.
Yeah.
So
I tell young worship leaders all the time, and I've even mentioned it on this podcast, like, it's sad to me that some worship leaders didn't grow up in the mid-90s.
Yeah, it was a good time.
Because you could play 2 chords and people would fall on the floor.
They would.
You know?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, so that was really formative. That was maybe a formative piece for you.
Yeah, that was everything. I mean, the worship team from that church, or one of the worship teams from that church, ended up becoming the Rock and Roll Worship Circus, which was our band that signed to, Integrity and did a lot of stuff in Christian music, circles at the time that band. But that band was like early 2000s, so this was like the mid 90s. All the
it was coming together then.
Yeah, and a lot of people were from that little church, like Chris Greeley, who's he's produced a few Bethel records. He's quite well known in like engineering circles. He was 8 years old when I met him at that church. He joined the worship team when he was 12. Just a killer guitar player,
Yeah.
And then dropped out of high school to join my band.
Great move.
To this day, it's worked well for him. I mean, he's still in the business and doing well. Don't necessarily advise it, but he was a talented guy, and it worked for him. So, there's a lot of folks. I'm trying to think of all the different people that came out of there.
Yeah, it's interesting how like sometimes there'll be something that happens at a church or in a time and space. Heather and I, we went to a ministry school in Charlotte for a year. It's where I met John Mark.
Oh, yeah.
And I met Josh Baldwin there.
Yeah, okay.
And but we were talking about like all the people that sort of were at this one spot in this one particular time, and then the influence that just sort of like shot out of that place.
Yeah, absolutely.
And this sounds like something kind of similar.
I mean, it really, where would Bethel even be on the West Coast without North Carolina? I mean, if you think about it, like the Helsers, William Matthews, Corey Asbury, Josh Baldwin, the McClures, like
isn't it strange?
A lot of people from one little spot. You know? And I wouldn't say that the little church I was from was like that, but I think the atmosphere of creativity and just the fact that it was the Northwest and you had a whole bunch of stuff happening in music at the time in Seattle, Nirvana and Pearl Jam and all that with the grunge movement. But in Portland as well, you had Everclear and the Dandy Warhols and a lot of, other things that were happening still to this day, Decemberists and the Shins and so much great music in this town. So, I think growing up in the church, churches are always an expression of their local community, and so there's a lot of great musicians in a small little church, a couple hundred people.
And I love even in the story that you were telling that it was involving like younger kids,
Yeah, absolutely.
Kids were coming up and playing guitar.
Yeah, and really good too. I mean, Chris is at the time he was at Bethel, he was their best guitar player, and he was back at the soundboard. He's just a phenomenal musician. So, yeah, it was a special time. Yeah, for sure.
So, why don't you talk to me a little bit about Rock and Roll Worship Circus days? Like, it came out of the church.
Yeah,
like it was
really
just
was.
Like your buds. Is that kind of what it was?
Yeah, and really, I think at the time, like mid '90s, there was vineyard music and there was the violet burning and all that. But really, I felt like, and I still do in some ways, feel like there was a low creative lid in the church. So it's kind of weird. But I had our worship team at church, and then a lot of us musicians had other bands. And when we'd write like a really cool song, they were for our bands. And if I had like a really bad song that was kind of cheesy, I'd be like, oh, this would make a great Christian song. Yeah. So, because Christians love bad music, right? So it was really not meaning to be disrespectful. It was just like, that's kind of not a great idea. So maybe I can turn it into a worship song that sings really simple. At some point though, for me, there became a pretty big gap between like going out and winning fans. And then like with our bands, that was always really great and our followings were growing or whatever. But then there was a difference when like you'd win a fan, they'd buy your record, they'd think you rock and I was a fan. But when I'd leave worship, someone would come up to me and tell me how God wrecked them or changed their life or whatever. And that gap grew pretty strong for me. And eventually, I felt like I had to give up the other. And I just thought, well, I wanted a successful band mostly to make my living doing music. It really wasn't about fame or power or, girls or anything like that. It was really about like, I just want to do this full time. Yeah. And I kind of gave that up and just thought, well, I'll probably never do music full time, but I'll at least raise the creative lid in our church. Maybe the rest of the church won't like worship that sounds like Pink Floyd and Radiohead, but I will. Yes. And that's what we'll write here. And that's what we did. And I think at some point it kind of surprised me because I felt like our little worship team was getting invited to go play, Tom Fest here in the Northwest, and different churches would spin out of that. And before we knew it, we were stringing together invitations to go on tour and writing songs that were mostly for our local church, and a lot of them, were really not even for the adults in our church. Like I wrote a lot of 60s Monkees, Beatles flavored pop stuff that I was a Dandy Warhols fan, number one, and that's what the Dandies did. So I thought that was cool. And then also there's just singable choruses for kids.
Yeah.
And it was interesting how it caught. It got a lot of attention and got us a record deal with Integrity, and just weird stuff kind of happened out of that.
Yeah.
That was so surprising.
I guess one of my questions, or one of the things I'm interested in, is because this came out of your local church, you had a pastor who would let you do this.
Yeah,
right.
We weren't on staff. I mean, so you couldn't really stop it.
Yeah,
but
yeah. You would make space.
Yeah, there was definitely space for it. I mean, there was a few other good bands out of that church as well, not just us. None of them got signed, but a lot of them did tour. And Tremolo Cowboys and Blackstones from my good friend Aaron, and just it was really cool, man. It was really fun.
I love that.
And yeah, he totally did. I mean, it was just, you had everything from like our rock and roll thing to like the Americana thing that the Blackstones did. You had this dude named Jerry Chapman, who's, now he's led worship at like Azusa, and he does a lot of like Native American reconciliation stuff, but he would literally just like, he'd go full on Native American on a Sunday,
Yeah.
And he was just like, it was crazy playing the bongos while he led worship, and all these native drums. It's nuts.
Amazing.
Yeah. So it was really cool.
All right. So how long did that last?
I think the circus was around from like 1999 to probably 2004. And then at some point, I felt I needed to evolve it a little bit. The Rock and Roll Worship Circus name was kind of a misunderstood thing. I had always intended it to be a circus like you'd call it in the UK, like Oxford Circus.
Yeah.
Or Piccadilly Circus is not like where clowns are. It's just an intersection. And that was really the formation of the name, is this is an intersection of rock and roll and worship.
Yeah.
As a fan of British culture, I got it, but nobody else did.
Yeah.
So anyway, I felt kind of constricted by the clown marketing and all that stuff, and we wanted to go a different path. The lineup had changed as well, because a lot of it was like based on we had like volunteers, like the band went from like 7 guys to 4, and then those 4 had changed out, and the 4 became a pretty consistent lineup that was really skilled. And so we changed the name to The Listening. It helped us a lot in Europe, and that band did really well. A lot of the Rock and Roll Worship Circus name was offensive to some Catholic countries, and
really?
we were doing a licensing deal with Furious and Fierce at the time, and they were having a tough time edging us into really predominantly Catholic territories. So,
and why were the Catholics opposed to the circus?
I think they felt that it was clowny.
Got it.
So they felt like we were trying to make a mockery of it, when really it was an intersection of rock and roll and worship. Is what we were trying to say. So, some of it, couldn't be helped, and some of it could have been probably if we wouldn't have leaned on circus imagery in the first release. But anyway, that was a topic for another time, where marketing gets out of your hands. But anyway, so we formed The Listening, and that was a fun run. That worked really well. It was indie. I mean, we were on Integrity for our first record with the Worship Circus, and the second one as well. And then Integrity dropped us, and we were able to go on as a kind of a different band with a massive following, and we could sell, quite a few thousand records just as indies, and made a good run with it. It was fun.
That's great. And then when did you sort of transition from being band guy to producer guy?
I think I was always producing. A guy here, it was interesting, in the Portland area, he got me involved in production sort of accidentally. He had engineered the first Worship Circus record, and he said to me, "You should produce records." And I said, "I don't even know what a producer does." And he said, "Oh, that's what you're doing." And I just was like, "I'm a band guy. I want to tour." And then about a month later, he called me. He's like, "Hey, I got you your first record to produce. There's a guy that I'm engineering for that doesn't have a producer, and I'd love for you to do it." And I told him no. And he said, "Well, it does pay $250 a day." And at the time, I think I maybe made $500 a month. So I was like, "Okay, sounds good. Where do I sign up?" So I found myself touring with the Worship Circus. And if you know anything about music record deals and touring and all, you'll know that for the first few years, you're not really making anything. I would come home and I'd produce records and make enough money to put some into savings, and then go on tour again. So I was always producing about 3 or 4 records a year. I did some stuff for BEC, some stuff for Tooth and Nail, Sherry Youngward, The Deadlines, different things like that. And that was fun. And then Aaron Spyro, who later signed to Sparrow Records, and before they were bought out by EMI. And
so it was always sort of the side project while you were doing the band thing.
Yeah, and I think at the end of the day, I do love producing a ton. And there came a point, I think, where I started getting tired of the road. I'd been on the road for about a decade. My wife and I had our first baby. The baby didn't love touring in a van. We never really got to the bus stage, so we were always in a van, truck stop showers, the non-glamorous side. And it made sense to kind of transition out of touring. I just didn't want to do it anymore.
Yeah. And then when you started making records full time, like when was how did you sort of land that in terms of like taking it to the thing you were going to do full time?
Yeah, I think some of it was trying to figure that out in the process.
Yeah.
I did move to Northern California. I'd moved to Redding. There was a lot of heat around Bethel music at the time.
Yeah.
It was right about the time that Bethel music started, and Jesus culture was well underway. I remember calling my buddy Jeremy Edwardson. I knew him from his time in the band The Myriad.
Yeah.
And The Myriad was a great band around the same time as The Listening. We did some shows with those guys. And Jeremy had built the sound house in Redding, and he had an A room and a B room. And I just called him and said, "Hey, I'm moving to town, and I'd love to rent the B room out if that's cool." And just from being in the band and having produced some records, I think I had enough clients to kind of get the train rolling.
Yeah.
And he let me lease the B room from him, and sometimes the A room as well. And I would just work out of his studio. And he'd throw me records. I mean, he had quite a few projects because of he's been the exclusive producer for Jesus Culture for a while. And if he had someone inquire and he didn't have the margin for it time-wise, he'd throw it my way, which I'm super grateful for.
Yeah, isn't that great?
Yeah, it was amazing. And that's kind of how I got involved with Bethel Music. Was eventually I had done some set design for them actually, which was super cool. Loft session set design and For the Sake of the World. They really thought I was more of an aesthetic guy. And then they had to ask somebody to produce without words. And he called me up and said, "Hey, would you help me with this? Because I don't run Pro Tools. I don't actually know how to produce." He was just a killer multi-instrumentalist named Garrett Viggers, who played dulcimer and all this stuff. Just a killer guy. And so he and I produced Without Words together. And
was that the first project you worked on there?
That was the first one I produced.
For Bethel?
Yeah, for Bethel. And so, and then from there, it was Tides and You Make Me Brave. And that really just was awesome for me. It really was. Amazing. I loved my time doing those records. It was really amazing. I learned so much and really got a lot better, and in a lot of ways, those records were super formative for me sonically and everything, just trying to dig deep. And how do we create a sound for Bethel music that's different than the work that they've done with Jesus Culture? How do we take this from like a fringe charismatic musical movement to something that any church would be comfortable doing?
Yeah, the whole world sings.
Yeah, exactly. That had to do for me less about sonics and more about songs. And I think as a producer, I've always had a really high value for lyric and melody. I've found that I can make any song sound cool, but if it's just a really cool sounding mediocre song, nobody wants to hear it. So, but like lyric and melody, man, when the lyric and melody is right, the songs record themselves.
Yeah, isn't it amazing how if lyric and melody are right, it's really hard to screw up the recording in some ways. Like it'll have legs.
Yeah,
I guess that's
sure.
what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it can even be a bad sounding song, but with a great lyric and melody, people go there.
Yeah.
And I don't know. There were some really important songs at that time. Jesus Culture had announced that they were leaving to go to Folsom and plant a church. And that was a hard time for everybody. It wasn't a church split, but it was like, you guys are leaving,
Yeah, you feel the lack of presence of those people.
Yeah, you definitely do. And we all loved them very much. And I remember just looking at the team, myself and my colleague Dan McKenzie, and it was the team that was making Tides. And we're like, all right, guys, what are we going to do? Like it's now or never. And we have to really push this thing forward creatively. And also, how do we get the writers to write about it? When we started Tides, it actually wasn't Tides. It was Loft Sessions too. That's what we'd been hired to do. And in the process of just like leaning into each other creatively and also like a lot of prayer, we're like, that just doesn't even sound right. Like, so we brought a whole bunch of, synths and amps and guitars and not acoustic instruments, to the studio. And I'll never forget, man, posting this picture of a Russian Big Muff pedal, which is like a fuzz pedal, on Instagram. We had just gotten done tracking the demo for, Loft Sessions 2 for Breaking Through, which is one of Jeremy Riddle's songs. And it was not acoustic. We had one acoustic guitar there, so we weren't totally rebellious, but it was like a rock and roll song. I posted this picture of a Russian Big Muff, and and I said, haven't gotten to use this in a while, and immediately got a text from Brian Johnson. And he said, you better be running your acoustic through that.
Yeah.
I said, you should probably come down and hear what we're up to,
Yeah.
So he and Joel came down, and I think, he wasn't necessarily like in a super huff, but I think he was concerned because this is the first major project they'd asked me to kind of go with,
Yeah, and I said, here you are breaking.
Here I am kind of like.
Taking the left turn.
Yeah. And he says, what are you guys up to? And I said, well, let's just pretend that we accidentally started pre-production on the next record after Loft Sessions 2. And we're going to go back to Loft Sessions as soon as you hear this demo. And we played it. And he was into it. He just looks at Jeremy. He goes, Jeremy, you like it? And Jeremy's like, I love it. And Brian says, are you going to make my song kick this much butt?
Yeah.
And I said, yeah, that could be arranged.
Yeah.
And so he said, he just kind of hit his chair and he's like, all right, Loft Sessions 2 is off the table. I don't know what you're making, but keep it up.
Yeah.
It was a great vote of confidence. It
so
really
did
was.
you, at that point, did you press into on the writing side? Like, were you pushing the writers to write in a new direction, or were you creating a sonic landscape and saying, let's explore this lyrically?
It was both.
Okay.
Because a lot of the songs were written for Loft Sessions 2. And then right in the middle of that transition to go to what became Tides sonically, Jesus Culture made their like a formal announcement. So everybody was kind of rocked, and I was like, man, this is the best time to make a record. The best records are kind of always written in a state of transition. Anyway, yeah, kind of a wild ride, but definitely there was a lot of writer's block to overcome, and just helping folks like Steph through that, and William and Jen. And
so let's talk about that
gang.
just for a second.
Yeah.
How are you helping people through writer's block? What are you doing to remove those obstacles as a producer, or as a just a co-conspirator and getting songs to happen?
I don't know. There's several exercises I'll give folks and things that I've learned throughout the years of Julia Crawford's teaching stuff on the artist's way, and working with Ted T was a great experience. He's a killer producer. He did all the Mute Math stuff in the early days, and Delirious is Mesomorphous, and so there's things I've gleaned along the way, but mostly it's just asking a person what they think about what they're writing, and they'll tell you if they're detached, or sometimes their performance will too. And there's a lot of tells, that people will have, and you'll feel a vocalist kind of lean away when they're not into it. And so if I notice that when they're delivering the song and they're just like, you can tell they don't believe it. And I think it's just giving them permission to dig deep. And then when they don't know how, it's kind of just a little bit of artist therapy, I guess.
Yeah.
Just giving them journaling exercises, or just conversational, just walking them through it, getting them to pay attention to what the voice of the Holy Spirit's like as a writing partner. There's we each have kind of like this inner conscience that will, that will egg us on and get us going the right direction. Sometimes there's like a critic that rides on our shoulder as well. And this inner critic just kind of shuts down our creativity. Yeah. And I think it's just helping somebody learn the difference between the inner critic and your conscience, and where to go with it. What
it's interesting how often we give that critic so much authority or so much freedom to influence us.
Yeah. And I don't know that it's directly Luciferian in its context, but I will say that anything that opposes my creative nature, I treat as the devil itself.
Yeah.
If I notice that it's, it's shutting me down creatively, it's got to be an enemy. Because that's the one thing I can say that feels divine in all of us is our creative essence, So it's like, if you're just shutting that down, then you've got to be the devil himself. Yeah.
Well, I know even from like some Bible stuff, like in Genesis 1, where it's Genesis 1, 26 and 28, where God says to mankind, he says, be fruitful and multiply. And I know we read that as like,
have kids,
get
pregnant.
But I've become convinced that that's really not totally what that passage is about. Because the same context for those two verses is that God has made mankind and he's made them in his image. And then he says, be fruitful and multiply, meaning that to live from our divine image is to make something. And this has to do with children, clearly, but it's not just children. This is like, for me, those passages are archetypal. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so there's a sense in which a person can't fully be a person until they become a producer rather than just a consumer.
Yeah.
Until you give birth to the thing that you're uniquely made to make, especially with other people.
Interesting.
And what's interesting about that is when we do that, we always make more people. Like, so it takes community, but then it gives birth to more community.
Yeah. Amazing.
Yeah. And what's interesting, even what you were saying a moment ago, is there's this sense in which there's this voice inside of us that is telling us, or, do this. We're being led in that direction. And at the same time, there's this other voice that's, it's critical.
Yeah.
It's the voice of our own insecurity, our own disappointments and pains. And, it's a battle.
Yeah, it is.
And I love hearing you as a producer being someone who's on the side of an artist, to use the Holy Spirit word, an advocate for an artist, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
To come alongside and say, no, let's listen to this other voice.
Yeah, and I think it's important too. My role as producer is very seldom paying attention to market consideration. I've just found that success and the desire for success, while it's a good thing, for it to be your core motivation for art, often makes art feel less genuine. And so a lot of times, I've been in really fun positions. Like I remember making John Mark's not Borderland, but Mercury Lightning.
Yes,
that we were standing under the shadow of Borderland, which was his most successful record up to that time.
Yeah,
and it was casting a really big shadow on him as a writer. Can I beat Borderland? Did I peak? Like all those questions in the back of his mind.
Yeah.
And that was part of the challenge of Mercury and Lightning, was getting John Mark to dive even deeper than he had on Borderland. And that's not to diss Borderland. That's a phenomenal record.
Of course.
But how do we get John Mark to write about something that is different than what he wrote about on Borderland, that's relevant to where he feels right now?
Yeah.
What's going on in John Mark's heart right now that's important for him to write about? Because there's this Davidic thing that we all have as writers, and I would say specifically church writers, but I think it's in general market too, where we're going to go through things that are super ahead of society, ahead of the other people in the church that we lead. And it's like we live a prophetic life of going through things and writing songs about them to lead other people through those things. I mean, the songs of David became the songs of Israel, and he wrote not for market consideration. He didn't write to have a great song that Israel could sing. He didn't write to have a national anthem. He wrote to document his history with the Lord. I've always seen David as like a blue collar Bruce Springsteen sort of guy. Like he's like in the field with the sheep, and he's like, "Oh my God, you're a shepherd like I am. This is crazy. You lead me like I lead them." And he writes a song about it. It's not like to be poetic, and then like
it's the lyrics of his life.
Yeah, you see Psalm 119. He's like stoked about the law because now he's a king. He didn't care about the law before, but now he's a king, and he's like, "Oh my God, your law governs me, and it governs the land. I love the law. I'm going to write a song with every letter of the alphabet dedicated to it." And it becomes Psalm 119. But then you also see he goes through the dark night of the soul, and he writes about his distance from God, and he writes Psalm 13 and Psalm 22 and or 23, whatever one. It's right next to the shepherd one. And it's the, I'm a worm, I'm dust. My God, why have you forsaken me? And everybody's like, great song, great prophetic word towards, Jesus, the upcoming Messiah. And I go, or it was just a great song.
Yeah.
And
the lyric of his life.
Yeah. Maybe that's the only place that Jesus could find comfort on the cross was in the song.
David also writes, "Blessed be the Lord, my rock," which has to be like a memory, right?
Yeah. All that great stuff. So, I think with all the writers I'm working with, I'm always trying to say, well, what's your wrestle right now? What are you going through? What's your history with the Lord for this moment now? And writing from that place. And for John Mark on Mercury and Lightning, it was a crisis of faith in some ways, a deconstruction of a whole bunch of things that he had just kind of banked on and taken for granted in faith, and an expansion of his faith and an expansion of his knowledge with the Lord, and the breakdowns in the middle of such, heaviness like that. It was killer. It was the best to be a part of.
Yeah.
I mean,
and you really hear it in songs like Wilder Love.
Oh my gosh. You hear it in Wilder Love. That was incredible.
I mean, it's right on the front in that song.
I think he really found it though, straight up. I think he found it on the bridge of Enemy Love, because I remember he just had this real, kind of emotional moment. I had to clear the studio out because I just saw him kind of come under the weight of it, and he just started to cry. And he sang this, "I'm willing, but I'm weak, I don't want to be your enemy."
Yeah.
And it was so killer, man. And I remember that became like the new sort of like water level.
That's the bar.
That's the bar for this record. And so, everything has to feel that good. and feel that real, or it's not right yet.
Yeah.
And it's great. So what was supposed to be about a 6-month record took 18 months because you have to give time for that process, you know?
Yeah. But what I love about what you're saying and what I hear is it's that thing of you being an advocate, you being someone who's with the writer, like side by side to say, I know there's something else in you.
For sure.
Yeah. Isn't it interesting that we need somebody to give us those kinds of words and encouragement?
Yeah, and I think that's in a lot of things that are difficult. I mean, that's why personal trainers make a great living too. It's like, one more rep.
You can do it.
Yeah, you can do it. You got 3 more lifts in you, you know,
That's
and it's that extra, 10% or whatever that they pull out.
Yeah, the other day I was listening to some crazy podcast and there's some guy, he's absolutely bananas. His name is David Goggins. You ever heard of that guy?
No.
Okay, he's like this ultra endurance guy. I think he's the only guy who's ever been a Navy SEAL, Green Beret, and Delta Force.
Oh wow, all 3.
Yeah, but he's like for a while held the world record for pull-ups, and he runs these races that are 200 miles and stuff.
Jeez.
And David Goggins was saying, I was listening to this, it was bonkers. He was saying like, when you think you're absolutely done, and your body can't give you one more thing, you've only done 40% of what's actually in you.
Whoa.
Yeah, and so he has this thing where he'll get like some new guy who's wanting to, come up a level or something, and he'll make them do 100 pull-ups. And, most people can't do that. So they get to 100 and the person falls on the floor and goes, okay, now we're going to do 100 more. He's like, you think you were done. We're doing 100 more, And what he was saying is everybody does it.
Crazy.
But you think that you're done. But
yeah,
really what you need is somebody to tell you, no, you're not done.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah. And it's kind of like some of this stuff, like it's soul digging in some ways, right? Digging down to the thing that's beneath the thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love it. I mean, to me, that and to capture those performances that come from that place is the thing that I love the most about making records. It's sonics are cool, and I love gear, and I love old microphones, and I love old synthesizers, and I love just turning knobs until things sound like Godzilla's crushing Tokyo.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's like doesn't matter at all.
Yes, the emotional component.
Yeah, if the emotion's not there, it doesn't matter if the artist isn't telling me an honest story. There's nothing more uninspiring than someone telling a lie, and you can hear it.
Well, I know John Mark says this sometimes. He says that he doesn't want to make propaganda for Jesus.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah,
it's so true.
And I think that's a great mantra to sort of live by as a writer.
Yeah.
Well, hey, I want to switch gears maybe just a little bit. You have grown up in the church later in life, started a band, did the touring thing. Now you're making records. So we're just sort of like reviewing there a little bit. But the idea behind this podcast, we call it the Ferment, meaning that things change, right? Things start off as grapes or grape juice and it ends up as wine. And there's some sort of like mystical, magical process in there that causes things to be different. I'd be really interested if you could tell us what's changed in your life over these last 15, 20 years, especially as it relates to like Jesus and how you approach the faith. Has anything changed? What's been formed or fermented?
Man, I hope that over time I've grown to be less of a judgmental asshole.
Yeah.
That's if I can think of anything, that's really, man, I pray that I have. I've been through a lot of things that have just been, like normal Christian upbringing stuff, purity culture and those sorts of things that, we're just part of kissing, dating goodbye and whatever else,
Yeah.
But I remember just as a younger man being a lot more, I should say a lot less understanding of sin and a lot less understanding of friends that, had depression or had suffered from anything, like gone through a divorce or whatever. And actually, I think probably the thing that humbled me the most was kind of coming to the end of myself. I went through a divorce as well. And that's more than a decade removed now. But as a younger guy, to fail at something, at anything, and to do it publicly, was really tricky. I lost a lot of friends. I don't know. I think it took something like my own failure to understand the failures of others and to have grace for it.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I wish I wouldn't have had to do that to just have grace in the first place. But I don't know. I think if anything has become wine over time, I hope it is empathy and compassion and just like letting people journey with the Lord on their own terms and not trying to dictate their journey.
Yeah.
And just being someone who can be a friend to anybody, regardless of anything.
Yeah.
You know, and kind of learning the difference between like being a friend and just a colleague, or being a friend and just a comrade. I heard it taught somewhere that the main difference is like comrades are people who are against the things that you're against, and you're like in life together, kind of going towards the same common enemy, you know, and colleagues are for the things you're for, and they're called into your life for a season to like, you know, fight for the same causes and go for the same things. But friends aren't necessarily for the things you're for or against the things that you're against. They're just for you.
Yeah.
And it's rare to find friends that, you know, and I kind of want to be that to people in my life, as someone who's just for them. And it doesn't matter if they make me look bad. It doesn't matter if they make me look good. Like I'm their friend because I love them and I'm for them and I'm for their success as much as my own.
Yeah.
And obviously you got to weed through that stuff, and there's the right people to choose to be friends. But I hope that I can be a better friend now than I've ever been to anybody because of the things I've gone through.
I know Richard Rohr says that we don't change by winning, we change by losing.
Yeah, I mean, there's the truth to that.
That's a hard word, but I mean, that's what I'm hearing, and even just the story you just told there.
Yeah,
it's like, well, what causes us to become more like Jesus? Oftentimes, it's failure and pain.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
for sure. I mean, it's interesting too, because you look at my life now, and hardly even, you know, I mean, it doesn't seem like there's a trace of that kind of debris. But that's, you know, I remember when I was in the dumps, man, I was terrible. Had gone through a divorce, had lost so much of myself in the process. I remember him looking at me and going, you know, the rad thing about your life is when there's an encyclopedia written about it, this won't even be in there. Or if it is, it's just like barely a line on the page. And right now it feels like this is the largest chapter in the whole book. But you're going to get past this, and, you know, and still a great friend to this day, you know.
Yeah.
And advice like that got me through.
Yeah, man, we need somebody to stand with us in our low moments.
Yeah, it's good, dude.
Amazing. Hey, to wrap things up here, I want to ask maybe like 3 or 4 more questions.
Yeah.
I would love for you to speak to worship leaders, maybe just for a minute. There's obviously like a worship culture now. Mm-hmm. It's sort of different in America than it was in the 90s or even in the 80s. You know, there's a worship industry that is sort of, well, it's a thing now. You can have a career.
Wow.
Those were things that were not even really around maybe when you and I were very first coming up. And that poses some opportunities, but also some challenges. And then there's lots of people who are just like in local congregations, you know, they're just showing up every Sunday morning with a bunch of volunteers playing rock and roll at 7:30 in the morning.
Right.
You know, but you've sort of like touched a lot of bases in your life, and you're still doing it. You're still making records. You're still helping people find their true voice. And
I still do lead worship in a local church as well.
Even better.
Yeah.
So I would love for you to just like, what would you like to say? Like, as somebody who's touched a lot of bases and done a lot of things, what would you like to say to people who are grinding it out week by week?
Well, I do have a lot of people. I get asked a lot, like, you know, do you have any aspirations outside of worship music? Do you have any desire to like affect the general market? You know, would you ever want to do a general market record? You know, things like that. Because really, predominantly, I'm working with faith-based artists, and it's weird, but that aspiration isn't in my heart because I feel like I'm already doing it. The truth of the matter is, like in the 90s when I grew up in Portland, there was the X-Ray Cafe. That was the only all ages club. And maybe sometimes you could get into La Luna's balcony, which would have been all ages as well. And then in Seattle, maybe there was like the Off Ramp, and those are the only all ages clubs, right? So my bands could maybe get a gig a month. And so that was our practice time on stage. We would play a gig a month And that's as much time as we got learning our craft. And then something crazy happened between Vineyard Music and especially with Delirious, where all of a sudden every local church, 5 years after King of Fools comes out, needs, a guitar player, a bass player, a drummer, a keyboardist. And those kids are typically the people that they would get, kids from the youth group, are playing, 4 and 5 times a week in front of 500, 1,000, 200. Now they're getting like way more reps on stage. And the result of that now, as all of the Christian musicians have the most stage time, is bands like Kings of Leon and artists like Katy Perry and Foster the People. And, it's phenomenal. If you look at any general market artists, whether it's Ryan Tedder from One Republic or whatever, they're worship team kids. They all grow up cutting their teeth. And so if you want to ask me, do you want to have an impact on the general market? I say, I already have. There's more kids playing guitar parts that I wrote on Tides than are playing songs by the Killers. Mm-hmm. And they're doing it week in, week out. And that's not to brag, but that's to say the impact's already there.
Yeah.
I don't know if you remember that old Sons of Thunder prophecy. Way back in the day, there was this.
You're talking about James Ryle?
Yeah, James Ryle's prophetic word about worship music and how it would impact mainstream culture and how the church could even be oblivious to it when it was happening. And I think that's what it is. I think the Sons of Thunder are actually already in our midst. The sons and daughters of thunder who do music, in the church and outside of the church. I mean, literally, the kids in Coldplay grow up in church and they carry an atmosphere of worship when they're in an arena. And sometimes they sing songs of faith and sometimes they don't. Like I remember a year ago watching the Grammys and the first 5 songs between Kesha's Pray and Kendrick Lamar and whatever else were preaching the gospel or talking about praying for somebody that has hurt them. I mean, I was like, man, this just would have never happened in the 90s. It would have never happened. But that's the result of worship team culture that I think has been really, really positive. Yeah. And so for the local worship leader, it kind of feels like you're on the treadmill a little bit. It's just like a hamster wheel of week in, week out. And the only big moments that you have to look back to are Christmas and Easter. I get it. Yeah. But you have to look at the kids that you're raising up and the impact that they're having, whether they're coming directly from you or just from the culture that you're a part of.
Yeah, that's an amazing take. That Sunday morning worship is doing more than we think it is.
It also saved the music industry. I mean, Veritas Guitars, prior to Mike Pope and Bobby Strand slinging those on the You Make Me Brave DVD, were selling like a guitar and a half a month. And now Casey's got a, 42 guitar waiting list or something like that. But also Fender and line array systems. Without worship, the houses of worship needing line array systems, where would D&B be? And all the companies,
the guys at home, industry. The guys at home at my home church, we laugh all the time about this thing you're talking about right now. Like there would be no boutique amps sold.
No.
Like those shops would not like
Strymon.
What is that?
What is right? What would that be without it?
Yeah. So the church is really creating an entire culture, an entire market in some ways.
Yeah. And definitely I think that what happens is a lot of kids get that playing time and then they realize, I don't know if worship is for me, but they carry this essence and this sort of like blueprint on their musical DNA of atmosphere and connecting to the audience and how to write a good song and how to play a good part. And they carry stage presence and they carry all that stuff and they form great bands. I mean, they're great bands, largely growing up in the church right now.
Amazing. I want to ask you one thing about songwriting too.
Yeah.
Okay. Before we wrap. Similarly, lots of people are in the church, they're leading worship and maybe some of them are writing songs. And you've already talked a little bit about like just advocating people through writer's block, but what else would you say to people who maybe know that there's songs inside of them and then they want to bring them to the local church, or they sometimes do, but they're not prolific, or they just feel, I don't know, they feel called and they don't know what the next step is. What would you say to people who are maybe aspiring writers?
Well, a couple things. I think that it's good to write in community. It's good to bounce your songs off of friends. It's good to lead the songs that you write. I just think it's important to write songs, though, whether they're congregational songs or not. Just make writing a part of what you do. I have a ton of exercises I give to writers that, everything from journaling to singing improvisationally for 20 minutes and capturing it all on voice memos and extracting the song ideas from those moments. But I think the biggest thing that you can do is write songs and then document them. Actually, for worship leaders in their local church, I think some of the best things they can do is make records. And it's not necessarily for the sake of like getting famous as much as it is when you're grinding it out week in, week out at your local church. and you have no milestones to look back on, and you have no platform for which people can take your songs home. So if there's any way that you can even make cheap recordings, I mean, like just make them in GarageBand or Logic, or you don't even need Pro Tools, but just document your songs and put them in some sort of acceptable format for upload to Spotify. I mean, it's so easy, but you can look back on this art that you create, and it allows people, number one, to, you know, participate in worship or your art or whatever, not just on a Sunday morning, but also it helps you look back and go, man, I wrote this collection of songs and I put it out there, and it's a milestone to look back on. We don't often have that. It's super biblical, whether it's the stones at the bottom of the Jordan or whether it's just the Psalms themselves. But I think it's important for local worship leaders and artists just to document their songs and make records.
Yeah. And it's great to always have a goal to, like, I've known for me anyway, to have a project to work on, or especially if there's a deadline, like deadlines and projects, all of a sudden I just become more creative.
Yeah.
You know, it's amazing, right?
No, you do. It forces you, and you also like want to refine it differently when you have to like present it. And that's important. You know, if you don't have a reason to like record your song or whatever, or format to record, you can just get lazy about finishing songs. You know, it's like, oh man, inspiration sprinted by and I got the first verse and the couple lines of the chorus and I'm not going to finish that song start. Yeah. You know, but you learn the hard work of putting elbow grease into like finishing a song when you have to. Yeah. And it's important.
Amen. Amen. All right. Hey, last question.
Yep.
Every single person who's on the podcast, we end with this question. Could you tell me about a time you experienced great joy? And it doesn't have to be like the most joy.
Just great joy.
Yeah, just a time.
Yeah, there's a few. The one that comes to mind immediately, though.
What is the one that's the top of mind awareness?
Is literally, there's this weird, cool guy named Georgian Banoff who's like so old school. And he literally is like, anytime he's in the room and like I'm leading worship or whatever, he jumps up on the stage with a fiddle and he just starts dancing like some sort of Bulgarian leprechaun. Yeah. It's like the most, I don't know what it is about that guy, but like, I can't help but like dance. Last time he was at church and he jumped up on stage, I literally knocked over the mic stand and my in-ear monitor thing because we were just carrying on so much. And he'll say things like, jump in the joy jacuzzi. He's just like, he's so gone. It's so out there. Yeah. But I love him so much because he just kind of brings me out of my cool shell. Yeah. And all the veneer that I try so hard to put on every day and to look like I have it all together kind of comes off, you know?
Isn't it great?
And then I just don't care. I mean, outside of my kids, I mean, the cliche answer would be like, oh, playing monster trucks with my boy or whatever else. Yeah. But, you know, when I think about
that
like,
comes to the top.
In worship, Georgian, all the way. That guy's gone. He's so gone. I mean, you'd have to be. He wrote Music Machine and Bullfrogs and Butterflies and like all these great kids songs. Yeah. And he just has this thing, even into his late 50s now or early 60s, however old he is. And he's just the man.
Oh, it's beautiful. It's beautiful. Hey, man, thanks for doing this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks for doing this. Peace.
Hey everybody, this is Casey Corum, the producer of the Ferment podcast. Thanks for listening. If you've been enjoying the podcast, I've got a couple ways you could really help us. First of all, review the podcast on iTunes or the podcast platform of your choice. This helps more people find us. Also, connect with us on social media, on Instagram at the Ferment Podcast and on Twitter at FermentCast. All right, people, see you next time.